they're actually pretty low, meaning that they characterize a minority of teens. So my argument has been that the typical teen does not live up to the stereotype. So I'm going to give you some data. I hear that you sometimes like to see data. I hope I haven't done too much of it, but I'm going to give you just an example in each of these domains of the type of data that leads me to this conclusion. So here's what we do in research. We make these fancy graphs, and on the left-hand side, we've got the extent of conflict between mother and offspring. Down here, we have kids' age. So this is a study that followed. It actually happened to be firstborn children in families with 2 children, so that's a secondborn, over a certain number of years. So what happens to conflict? Let's look at the firstborn going from 11 to 13 years of age. Yes, conflict goes up, it increases for this firstborn compared to childhood. Then it actually goes down to age 19. But what I want you to look at, focusing on the firstborn, is this is the highest level of conflict, right? Without going into detail, this is a scale of conflict. It measures conflict in all kinds of domains, and it actually goes up to somewhere up at like 60 is the highest, or maybe even higher. What I want to tell you is that this level of conflict is basically equivalent to, we have conflict between a couple of times in the past year and a few times each month. Okay, I would argue that that's not a highly prevalent rate of conflict. For now, we'll leave aside the fact that secondborns, their conflict with parents actually peaks when the firstborn is going through adolescence and then declines. So, okay, one other study that, again, just look at the big picture here. This is measuring negative interactions between teens and parents from 12 to 20. This is basically a scale low to high. This is the typical conflict, the average level of conflict, negative interactions across these ages. This is a relatively low level of negative interaction, and it's pretty stable across those years. This is family social support, low to high, pretty high. Feelings of we support each other in this family across those ages. I'm picking these out as examples, but I've looked at lots and lots of studies of these things, and I'm showing you trends that are very typical. Yes.
So it says gender and ethnicity. Are we to understand from that that it's pretty similar, or called
Yes.
all? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so all these lines are different, male, female, and white, non-white in this particular sample.
They're almost the same.
Okay? All right, so that's relationships. And again, I'm trying to tell the story that problems might go up sometimes, but absolute prevalence of the problems tends to be pretty low. Let's look at behavior. So what goes up at adolescence? Well, risk-taking goes up. Let's just say that right off the bat. Adolescents are more interested in novelty, trying new things, than younger children. But risk-taking primarily goes up when the consequences are ambiguous, not when they're clear. And in terms of how high or low are problematic kinds of behaviors, what I would say is experimentation is high, consequences are ambiguous, they see adults doing things that are interesting, they want to grow up, and so they tend to experiment with things like drinking alcohol and having sex. Things that adults seem to convey are kind of good things. So yes, they experiment with those. But persistent, serious risk-taking is low. So again, the typical teen doesn't live up to the stereotype. So the example I'll give you here is alcohol use. This is, have you ever used alcohol in your lifetime? It's across history, 1975 to 2023. So let's just focus on 2023 for ease of looking at all this data. This is 8th grade, 10th grade, 12th grade. The chance that someone has tried alcohol goes up as children get older. At 12th grade in 2023, a little over half of teenagers have tried alcohol. Okay, so it's one of the most normative risk-taking behaviors there is. But here's binge drinking. Have you done any binge drinking in the last month? Well, now, again, it goes up with age, but now we have 10.2% of 12th graders saying that they have engaged in binge drinking. You can also notice, of course, big historical changes, which I'll come back to. All right, so same thing. Some problems go up, but overall prevalence of persistent serious problems does not fit the stereotype. Let's talk about emotions. Problems sometimes rise from childhood to adolescence. Turns out if you sample moods on a daily basis over and over, the percent of moods throughout the day that are positive goes down as children go through adolescence, and the risk of clinical depression increases. So they're going actually up toward adulthood, where clinical depression is more likely than it is in childhood, and that happens during adolescence. And trajectories do differ by culture and race, which I don't have time to get into in detail, but that's part of the story too. What about prevalence? Well, even at their lowest point, daily moods are more positive than negative in the typical teenager. So they become less positive than childhood, but they're not going from positive to very negative. Serious emotional problems have been low historically, and they're still far from inevitable, but it is true that the prevalence of those problems has risen markedly in the recent cohort of teens. So I want to talk about that last point for a minute. What's going on with teenagers and more serious emotional problems right now from my perspective? This is just data showing that in 2023, almost a third of teenagers 12 to 17 have sought out mental health treatment. So still not a majority, but a solid 1/3, which is concerning and higher than in the past. All right, this is a little more complicated, but it's really interesting. This is a graph of the percent of individuals reporting major depressive episodes, so a serious depressive episode within the last 12 months by age group. And I want to start, so this is 2009, and here's 50 plus, down here around 5% of people that age, and that stays pretty stable. Well, I'll come back to the stability. But then younger people are up here, right around 8%. A little bit higher in 12 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 25-year-olds than 26 and beyond. But all those younger cohorts were right at about 8% of individuals having reported a major depressive episode in the past 12 months. Fast forward to 2017, we still have 50 plus, if you're 50 or older, down here around 5%. 26-year-olds to 49-year-olds still around 8%. But anybody under 26 is up here, still not a majority, 13%, but much higher than what we saw a little over about a decade earlier. What's going on there? Well, we may hear more about this, and maybe in the Q&A we can go into it, but there are some unique pressures that I'll just mention a couple of them that are getting a lot of conversation in my field. One is, especially for more affluent teens, just exceedingly high pressure to succeed and to do tons of stuff and to excel very highly at that. So that's one piece. And then the other thing is social media. And social media as related to social isolation. Social isolation is not good for any of us. We are all more socially isolated than we used to be, but it's hitting teens hard. That's the hypothesis. So I want to show you one more graph, and that is about loneliness. This is the prevalence of high loneliness in individuals going from age 18 to 21. This is by birth cohort, and the main takeaway here is this is females, this is males. This is people born before 1997, down here. The top line that's pink is people born after 1997. In this cohort, you can just see visually much higher reports of loneliness in both females and males. This starts at age 18, but through basically young adulthood, from adolescence into young adulthood. So I'll leave it at that. We can talk more about loneliness, but what I want to say at this point is that the actual typical teens' emotion, behavior, and relationships is better characterized by the descriptors I have here. The emotions are more positive than negative, but there's an increased risk for loneliness and depression in recent cohorts. In terms of behavior, they're open to experimentation. They do typically learn from consequences and modify that behavior. And actually, relationships with parents tend to be close. There's occasional conflict, of course. Don't we all have conflict in our close relationships occasionally? They typically adopt, sorry that got covered up, parental values. Parents are important is the take home there. Peers become important, but parents remain important. So, what are some influences on teen mental health? I want to dispense with the idea that problems are an inevitable result of biology. If they were, we'd see much more prevalent problems than we see. Brain development's been talked a lot as a cause of risk-taking. It's vastly oversimplified, can't go into the details, but I want to dispense with that. Environment does matter a lot. We saw historical changes. We know that there are differences in different cultural and racial ethnic groups in some of these behaviors. And I'll just mention again affluence and on the other end, poverty. Extremes on both ends are actually associated with higher levels of problems. Poverty's not good, it's got its own stressors. High affluence is not a protective factor. The highest rates of depression, anxiety, and substance use, underage substance use, actually occur in students who attend highly affluent schools. In my work, what I've studied and would like to emphasize is that our expectations, this goes back to stereotypes now, our expectations for students matter, for children matter, and in part that's because expectations can become self-fulfilling prophecies. I'll tell you, give you an example of that in a minute. And relatedly, expectations influence the opportunities we give or withhold from adolescents. So let me give you an example or two of this before I wrap up. So how can self-fulfilling prophecies happen as related to expectations? So this is just one example. Say I'm a parent and I think really serious difficulty is just inevitable. You know, all these bad things are just biologically driven. What happens is, one thing that happens is my self-efficacy as a parent drops. What can I do about it? I feel less efficacious or less able to make a positive difference. If I feel that way, I as a parent make fewer efforts to provide what I'm going to call developmentally appropriate autonomy. Parents who feel less efficacious are more likely to either throw up their hands and say, do whatever you want, there's nothing I can do until you grow up, or they're more likely to clamp down and be really, really strict, which also is not the best for parenting adolescents. And so in both of those cases, adolescent rule breaking increases and self-fulfilling prophecy. One other example, because alcohol is such a big risk-taking behavior, say I think underage drinking is inevitable, like serious underage drinking is inevitable. So my parenting belief is better they do it in my home than elsewhere. They'll become more responsible and be safer if I allow it. Which leads me to have what we call permissive alcohol practices. You're allowed to drink as long as you're at home. I'll provide beer for your party with your friends as long as you stay at home. Turns out there's a lot of good research on this. That does not predict more responsible drinking. That predicts more drinking and more dangerous drinking. So, self-fulfilling prophecy. So, what can we as people and institutions do? I feel like there are so many things, and we can talk about more in the Q&A, but I've listed some that I think are important that come immediately to mind.